And thank you so much for doing this. If we were to speak about cyberspace, it's not like Las Vegas, is it? What happens in cyberspace doesn't stay in cyberspace. It can have real-world implications.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So first, it's great to be here with you. Indeed, it's no surprise that the evening before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia conducted a cyber attack on a company providing satellite communication services for Ukraine's military, with the goal of disrupting the Ukrainian military's ability to communicate. Well, at the same time, it impacted a broad set of windmills in Germany who use that same satellite to communicate, and several thousand French homes who were using, again, satellite communications. So certainly what happens in cyberspace plays out not only in the ability of a military to communicate, but also in the day-to-day, can somebody at home in another country, far from a given conflict, be able to communicate as well.
So are we talking about cybersecurity, cyber attacks having an impact on our schools, on our infrastructure, on hospitals, on ports, on transportation? All of these things can suddenly stop.
Yes, our economies are increasingly digitized, right? They have systems that are connected to the internet. Think about when somebody's checking into a hospital. They'd like that hospital to have access to their doctor's medical records. They want the pharmacy to know who they are if the hospital's sending in a prescription. All of that requires linked communications, a pipeline, maintaining the connectivity across the pipelines to know, was there a spill, remotely monitoring that, potentially by drones, to look and say something unusual here and communicating that to headquarters to accelerate an emergency response team. All of that means that our critical infrastructure is connected to the internet, is connected to each other. Sometimes those connections, in many cases those connections, were made without building in adequate security. So there's a level of vulnerability across US, across UK infrastructure, which governments are racing to address, even as we see both criminals and countries exploiting those vulnerabilities for their purposes.
Are they racing fast enough, though? I mean, because if you look at the situation in the United States, the bulk of the infrastructure is privatized. How do you convince them, to take their security seriously?
That's a core challenge. The fact that critical infrastructure, pipelines, water systems are owned by private companies who may not necessarily have the same threat picture. So as a result, there have been a set of things that governments have been working to do over the last few years which have really accelerated. One is leaning forward and sharing threat intelligence with CEOs, with companies, and increasingly declassifying that threat intelligence and sharing it more broadly with publics to help them understand the threats and the need to lock our digital doors. And fundamentally, defense is a lot harder than offense, right? A person think about it in the physical space. If you have a guard, they need to be watching every door or window for a potential entry. An intruder only needs to find one that's cracked open. So as a result, defense is harder, and it's playing on software and hardware that's across our critical infrastructure that wasn't necessarily built as secure as it needs to be for the threat and the reliance we have on that.
Where are the threats coming from? China, Russia, Iran? Are these the places that we're seeing the threats come to a place like the United States or here in the UK?
Yes, they're coming from countries like the countries you mentioned for purposes that align with their geopolitical goals, as well as from criminals. Some of the most disruptive threats that we're seeing today, for example, against hospitals, what the NHS experienced, the recent rise in hospital attacks we've seen in the US and Romania and other countries, are coming largely from criminals who are doing it for financial gain, to ransom those systems and require their owners to pay a ransom payment. And we've been, together with the UK government, who's such a close ally with the United States in all of our cyber work, a shout out to the fantastic Cyber UK last week that brought almost 40 countries together to discuss and ally on these issues. We've really been focused on how to address that key threat.
How does AI intersect with cyber threats?
AI is a classic example of there's tremendous promise in accelerating some of the hard work of cybersecurity and potentially helping us find vulnerabilities in code and fixing them before code is deployed, as well as dual use on the offensive side. It helps attackers do exactly the same thing. So the job we have is to really use AI quickly on the cyber defense side. In the United States, the President's executive order tasked pilots both in the national security community and in the homeland security community to quickly take a look at this space, how to use AI on the defense side, because we know it'll be used by attackers, both high-end attackers, potentially to scale, as well as on the criminal side, potentially to raise up their skills and build offensive malware even more quickly.
How worried should people be about all of this? I mean, not necessarily panicked, but scared, because, I mean, most recently in January, for example, we saw deep fakes. This feels like a massive cyber weapon that's now being used, deep fakes using Joe Biden, for example, or Taylor Swift.
So first, there are things each person should be doing to make it riskier, costlier, and harder for cyber attacks to be successful. Things like keeping encrypted your most important personal data. Passwords are no longer effective, using multi-factor authentication, which is another factor, to make and protect your data. And certainly on the company side, governments have been working with companies to put in place minimum cybersecurity measures at pipelines, at airports, to ensure that, for example, data is encrypted, so that even if an attacker steals large swaths of medical data, it can't be used to blackmail broad swaths of the population, as we've seen in Scotland and Australia, because the data is encrypted. So there are things that we all need to be doing to make it harder. That being said, AI does present a risk on the cyber side that both governments and the private sector need to work closely together to address.
What would you say is the difference between China's approach versus Russia's approach when it comes to cyber?
It's a really interesting question. For a long time, we saw China put a significant focus on espionage, notably spying to benefit Chinese companies in the strategic technology areas that were important to them, as well as for government purposes. Now we see China pre-positioning in critical infrastructure, particularly in the US and in some countries in the Indo-Pacific, we believe, in order to potentially disrupt that infrastructure in a time of crisis. So our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen deploy from the same ports and the same airports that our civilians do. So potentially disrupting those and the ability of that to move in a time of crisis, or to message a population to say, is this a conflict you want to get in the middle of? On the Russia side, Russia has a very sophisticated offensive cyber program, but we also see an increasingly permissive environment for both hacktivists and criminals based in Russia that are conducting cyber attacks on critical infrastructure.
And Anne, are you finding they're working together? I mean, we saw President Putin in China last week in Beijing. They promised all sorts of things economically and a friendship with no limits. Are they working together in this space?
That's something we're watching for closely. I don't think we see yet closer collaboration on the offensive cyber side, but clearly the support that China is providing Russia in its war in Ukraine has been concerning, and that closer collaboration is something that we need to watch for.
Let's talk about TikTok, because we're seeing this big debate in the United States where, we're currently seeing the US by law is forcing a divestiture and failing that, a potential ban. What sort of message do you have for Britain on this?
We're a democracy, the US and the UK. And one of the most important things in a democracy is that free debate, people being able to get out different sets of facts and debate ideas on a given issue. We want that free debate. It's part of what makes a diverse society diverse. When we look at China, the Chinese government censors its domestic debate. It censors what its population can say online, what its population can debate online, and certainly the way the Chinese government and its views are viewed. So the idea that a platform with close ties to the Chinese government would be the primary source of information for, at least in the United States, the population from 18 to 35, or 18 to their low 30s, is of course a concern to us.
You worked in the NSA for a number of years. There are some in some quarters who believe that the real threat to civil liberties is the NSA GCHQ. What would you say to them?
Intelligence agencies in democracies have a special obligation. Not only do they need to keep their country safe, they need to do so with the trust of their citizens. And I think you've seen over the last decade, really since the media leaks of 2013, greater efforts, I'll speak for the United States since that's where I'm most familiar, to bring more transparency, to talk about the rules in place, to talk about the way agencies comply with law, to talk about how they manage and they work to both be intelligence collection agencies, but also be a part of their societies. The employees are fundamentally Americans and Brits, right, who are a part of those same cultural values, respect the privacy of their countries, and know that even as they work to keep their country safe, if the average citizen doesn't feel that their intelligence agencies operate under the rules and values, then something has been lost. So I think people take that seriously each and every day, and fundamentally, having spent more than a decade inside and walking, knowing the rules, walking the hallways, sitting side by side with analysts, I feel very confident that those rules, the respect for privacy and civil liberties, are a part of the day-to-day work of both NSA and GCHQ's work each and every day.
Anne, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here with you.